I woke up to the soft Texas morning light slipping through the sheer curtains of my family estate. The usual quiet of the early spring morning, a stark contrast to the storm brewing in my chest. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, hesitating for a moment before logging into my online bank account. I had this nagging feeling all week, a quiet unease I tried to ignore, but the moment the screen loaded, it hit me like a punch I hadn't seen coming. $1 million, gone. Transferred. Secretly. And my sister's name flashed beside the amount. Paris trip. I stared at it, blinking, hoping my eyes were deceiving me, hoping it was a glitch. But no. The numbers didn't lie. My trust fund, years of careful savings, of sacrifices that felt invisible, of planning for a future I never imagined doubted, had been quietly handed over for her pleasure. Arlize, my younger sister, exuberant, beautiful, oblivious. The weight of it crushed me. I reached for the silver necklace my grandmother had given me, the one she had pressed into my hands the day I left for college, whispering, "Build with integrity, Eloan. Always with integrity." I held it tight, letting the cold metal anchor me, trying to channel her wisdom, her strength. Memories flashed, her soft voice in the dim kitchen, the subtle pride she had in the smallest victories. It reminded me who I was supposed to be: resilient, composed, strategic. Not the invisible daughter, the one overlooked and minimized. Not this daughter who now felt every betrayal sharpen against her ribs. I thought about confronting my parents, about storming into the sunlit living room and demanding explanations. But the rational part of me, the part one had honed over decades of managing both work crises and family nuances, cautioned patience. I watched Arlize from the doorway, a whirlwind of excitement as she zipped around, packing a chic suitcase, tossing silk scarves haphazardly over her shoulder, humming a tune I once envied her for knowing how to carry effortlessly. My stomach churned. How could they, after everything, choose her over me? After years of ensuring that every detail in our family, from bills to events, ran smoothly, silent, unacknowledged, careful, I had been replaced in their eyes. The anger simmered under the surface, mingling with disbelief, with a self-blame that stung. Had I missed some cue? Been too compliant for too long? My phone buzzed then, startling me out of the spiraling thoughts. A message from my CEO flashed on the screen. Urgent. Project update. My professional life, the one arena where I had control, discipline, and respect, suddenly collided with the personal betrayal that had just unraveled my morning. I could feel my pulse quicken. The timing was uncanny. Was this an opportunity or another burden? I opened the email carefully, scanning for details while internally running through options. Confront my parents immediately? Risk emotional explosiveness and lose composure? Focus on work, keep the betrayal tucked away until I had a strategy? Or somehow, navigate both, using my intellect and planning to regain control? My mind raced, plotting scenarios, recalling every past slight, every pattern of favoritism and neglect that had silently shaped my perception of my family. I paused at the sight of the necklace glinting in the morning light. My grandmother had always believed in the quiet, steadfast power of integrity. This was not just jewelry, it was a signal, a reminder, an anchor to a stronger self. I breathed in deeply, allowing the memories to steady me. I would not be passive. I would not be diminished by their decisions, by their favoritism, by their disregard. The necklace felt heavier now, not as a weight, but as armor. I will not let them rewrite my worth, I whispered to myself, a promise that reverberated through the hollow ache in my chest. The next buzz of my phone brought me back to the present with a jolt, an email, bold letters flashing urgent, CEO meeting update. My fingers trembled slightly as I opened it, heart tightening. Career credibility, professional stakes, suddenly intertwined with a personal betrayal so profound it left me reeling. I sat there, fingers poised over the keyboard, mind spinning through permutations and strategies. How to address my professional obligations while safeguarding my personal boundaries. How to transform this shock into leverage, into action. Every instinct screamed, every past lesson whispered caution. I took a moment, breathing deliberately, letting the shock recede into a clarity that was sharp and precise. I was not powerless. Not today. Not after everything. Yet, as I sat there in the morning sunlight, the house eerily quiet aside from Arli's humming, I realized the magnitude of the challenge. This wasn't just a family issue, it was a convergence of personal and professional stakes, a test of strategy, patience, and endurance. I would have to move carefully, think 3 steps ahead, anticipate reactions, and fortify my resolve. One decision wrong, and it could unravel everything, my financial footing, my professional reputation, my sense of self. The silver necklace pressed into my palm reminded me, I had to be deliberate, wise, and, above all, unwavering. I leaned back, closing my eyes briefly, feeling the betrayal seep into every corner of my mind, but also sensing the stirrings of calculated determination. The air was thick with tension, with the silent promise of confrontation yet to come. One thing was clear, I would not allow this to stand unchallenged. I would navigate the treacherous waters ahead, balancing fury with cunning, disappointment with strategy, and betrayal with deliberate action. My life, my worth, my integrity, those were non-negotiable. Every careful breath, every subtle observation of Arli's, every internal calculation reinforced my plan, my patience, my silent vow. They had underestimated me, but I would rise. The shrill ring of my phone cut through the quiet of my home office, jolting me from a haze of thoughts about the morning's betrayal. An unknown number flashed across the screen. Hesitation gripped me for a split second, but something in the tone of my instincts told me to answer. Eloin? The voice was sharp, urgent, my CEO. The weight of his words landed immediately, a major project was at risk, deadline slipping, and I was needed in person within hours. My chest tightened. I felt the old familiar pull of responsibility mixed with the raw sting from earlier. How could I focus on corporate urgency while my family had just undermined every sense of trust one had cultivated for decades? Yet, I knew that this was not the moment to falter. Timing mattered. Every decision now could ripple into both my career and the personal betrayal still fresh in my mind. I glanced at Arli's Paris itinerary lying open on the kitchen counter, the destination mocking me with a luxury I had labored for quietly. The juxtaposition of her excitement and my outrage was unbearable, yet oddly clarifying. I forced myself to breathe, noting each element that needed my attention. Emails awaited, project reports demanded review, and the CEO's urgent notes required precise understanding. I moved systematically, separating my personal shock from professional imperatives. My fingers skimmed the numbers, budget allocations, and stakeholder sensitivities, mentally plotting leverage points. Years of unnoticed diligence had honed this instinct: remain calm, act strategically, anticipate outcomes. I could not let this mix of personal betrayal and professional stakes crumble my focus. Between phone calls and quick glances at financial spreadsheets, my mind darted to family, the faces of my parents and sister weaving between urgent work realities. Anger and frustration swelled, yet I reminded myself of the chessboard approach, every move deliberate, every reaction measured. I thought of my mentor's voice echoing from years past: handle crises like a chess game, not a fire drill. The advice had never felt more vital. I mapped allies both at home and in the office, considering who could be trusted with sensitive information, who might tip the balance if I needed support. My pulse quickened with the duality of this challenge, each tick of the clock emphasizing how intertwined my worlds had suddenly become. Minutes felt like hours as I rehearsed potential conversations in my mind, what I would say to the CEO, what I might reveal of the family situation, and what details were best kept private for strategic advantage. I weighed confrontation against patience, the timing of disclosures against the potential fallout. Even as my hands typed emails and my eyes scanned documents, the silver necklace from my grandmother rested against my collarbone, grounding me. It had been a morning comfort, now a symbol of calculated control, reminding me to channel indignation into precise action rather than reckless emotion. I imagined her whispering again, "Integrity is your compass, Eloan. Let it guide every step." As the hour approached for the meeting, adrenaline sharpened my focus. I packed my bag with meticulous care, ensuring my laptop, notes, and evidence of project status were organized to the last detail. My mind raced not only with tasks but with strategy, when to introduce personal knowledge, how to maintain authority and composure, and how to turn the unforeseen call into an advantage. I could feel the tension coil in my shoulders, a mixture of anticipation and restrained fury. This was more than a corporate challenge, it was an opportunity to assert control where I had been blindsided before. Every step, from the drive to the office to entering the sleek lobby, would be calculated, every word measured, every gesture intentional. Finally, as I approached the towering glass doors of the corporate office, I paused to center myself. The morning sunlight reflected off the windows, a cold brilliance that mirrored my own clarity of purpose. I rehearsed my opening lines, imagined the questions the CEO might pose, and the silent counters I would deploy if pressed. The personal betrayal that had shadowed my morning would not be revealed recklessly, instead, it would be leveraged at the optimal moment, like a subtle, decisive move in a game only I fully understood. With a deep exhale, I stepped inside, each footfall echoing with determination. I was ready to navigate this intersection of personal pain and professional necessity, to confront urgency without losing composure, and to emerge not as the overlooked daughter, but as the woman who could command both worlds with quiet, unwavering intelligence. I stepped into the quiet study of our family home, the late afternoon sunlight slicing through the blinds, casting sharp lines across the polished wood floor. My fingers trembled slightly as I sifted through the stack of financial documents, receipts, and account statements I had gathered. Something in the back of my mind had insisted I dig deeper after the morning's realization, and now the evidence unfolded before me with brutal clarity. There it was, a transfer of $1 million from my trust fund, silently, deliberately, for Arli's Paris trip. My breath caught. The numbers didn't lie. My parents had acted without consent, without notice, leaving me blindsided, an invisible player in my own life. For a moment, I refused to believe it. Maybe there was an accounting error, an overlooked detail. I checked and double-checked every statement, each cross-reference cementing the harsh truth. The denial faded, replaced by a simmering anger that I had long suppressed in the name of family harmony. I could feel the tension knot in my shoulders, my chest tightening with every heartbeat, a familiar ache from years of being overlooked, my efforts dismissed, my loyalty unnoticed. Memories surfaced unbidden, my dedication to family projects, my sacrifices during holidays, quietly bearing burdens without acknowledgement. Each flashback sharpened the sting, highlighting the pattern that now revealed itself with unmistakable finality. I sank into the leather chair, letting the papers slide to the floor beside me, and tried to breathe through the swell of emotions. Hurt, frustration, and disbelief wrestled within me. I imagined standing before my parents, confronting them, voice tight but steady. The thought of the inevitable arguments, raised voices, and defensive deflections made my stomach churn. I knew the conversation could spiral quickly, as it always did, turning private grievances into public battles in our living room. I inhaled, reminding myself that strategic patience was essential. Impulsive reactions would only undermine my position, giving them the upper hand they had so long maintained. While the room remained still, I traced the lines of the furniture, noticing subtle details, my grandmother's silver frame on the desk, the faint scent of her favorite lavender lingering in the air. Her quiet wisdom echoed in my mind, urging me to consider each step, each word. I realized that intelligence and composure could serve as weapons more potent than any outburst. I began listing in my head the ways I could respond, from discreetly consulting financial advisors to collecting documentation that corroborated the suspicious transactions. Every mental note reinforced a disciplined approach, every imagined scenario prepared me for the confrontation that would inevitably come. From the corner of the room, I could hear Arlize humming upstairs, excited about her upcoming trip. The contrast between her carefree anticipation and my simmering awareness of the truth was almost unbearable. I forced a calm exterior, masking the inner storm. Observing her movements, the way she packed her suitcase with meticulous care, I felt a mixture of irritation and a pang of jealousy, not for material indulgence, but for the recognition she would receive that had always eluded me. This quiet observation offered insights into my family's dynamics, a subtle behavioral map that might guide my approach when the moment to confront them arrived. My thoughts shifted back to the evidence. The careful transfers, the timing, the way they had assumed I would remain oblivious, all of it suggested calculation, not oversight. I imagined discussing the matter with them, my words deliberate, measured, each sentence a probe into their justifications, their reactions. I rehearsed silently, how could you do this without consulting me? Was my effort, my contribution, never enough? The internal dialogue sharpened my resolve, reinforcing that this was not simply about money, it was about respect, acknowledgement, and reclaiming agency in a family that had long dictated the terms of my visibility. As the afternoon waned, I heard the faint click of the study door. My pulse jumped. The sound was subtle, but unmistakable. Someone had entered or moved closer. Every instinct told me that in the next few minutes, the trajectory of my family's balance of power, and perhaps my own, would shift. I straightened in my chair, smoothing the papers before me, controlling the tremor in my hands. Every sense heightened. I was ready, mentally and strategically, to navigate the confrontation with precision, to ensure that my voice, long subdued, would now carry weight. And yet, beneath the careful planning, a current of fear ran through me. One misstep could undo everything I had calculated. The silence in the room became a taut wire, each creak of the floorboard or shift in the air signaling that change was imminent. I felt my grandmother's presence in memory, her voice urging patience, wisdom, and resilience. The necklace resting against my collarbone earlier this morning seemed to hum softly in my mind, a reminder of inherited fortitude. I breathed deeply, centering myself. The time for impulsive anger had passed, the moment for strategic action had arrived. I would confront, yes, but on my terms, with full awareness of the stakes, knowing that composure, intelligence, and precise timing were now my strongest allies. The evidence lay before me, undeniable, and the stage was set for the reckoning that would define the next phase of our family's intricate, fragile balance. The dining room was quiet except for the faint hum of the evening air conditioning. I sat at the polished oak table, a folder of evidence spread before me, heart hammering in rhythm with the quiet tick of the wall clock. This was it, the first real test of courage in a family that had long measured my worth in silence and compliance. I inhaled slowly, centering myself, making sure my voice, when it came, would carry calm authority instead of impulsive accusation. Arlize was elsewhere, blissfully unaware, giving me the space I needed to confront the parents who had betrayed me without warning. I reviewed the documents one last time, ensuring that every number, every receipt, every transaction was accounted for. Accuracy was my shield, composure, my weapon. When I finally looked up, my parents were seated across from me, expressions polite but unreadable. I began carefully. I've reviewed the family accounts, and there's a $1 million transfer to Arlize's Paris trip that I wasn't informed about. My voice was even, controlled, yet the words hung heavy in the air. There was a flicker in my mother's eyes, a slight tightening of my father's jaw. At first, they denied it, deflected, minimizing the action as a simple oversight. I presented the documents methodically, letting each piece of evidence speak for itself. Their body language betrayed more than their words, the subtle shift of shoulders, the way eyes darted to avoid direct contact, the pause before answering, all spoke volumes. I reminded them of the countless times my contributions had been ignored, framing the betrayal not just as financial, but emotional. My parents tried to justify the transfer, claiming it was for educational enrichment and family benefit, layering their words with phrases that implied duty and care. "We did this for the good of the family," my father said, his tone practiced, expecting compliance. I listened silently, each argument analyzed and countered in my mind. Guilt trips and rationalizations meant nothing to me now. I could see the inconsistencies, the patterns repeating from previous years. I maintained my calm, strategic demeanor, allowing their words to reveal their logic, or lack thereof, without giving in to reactive anger. I noted every contradiction, every pause, storing it for future moves. Then, with deliberate clarity, I shifted the tone. "I've always trusted you to act in my best interest," I said, letting the weight of the statement land. I highlighted the consequences of their decisions on trust and respect within our family. My voice didn't waver, yet inside, a storm of anger and disappointment surged. I watched as they adjusted uncomfortably, recognizing that their defenses had cracks. My calmness was not weakness, it was precision, signaling that I had calculated the stakes and knew exactly how to leverage this moment. I could see small openings, subtle vulnerabilities in their approach, that hinted at the possibility for future advantage. The conversation stretched, taut with tension, every word measured, every gesture noted. I balanced controlled outrage with tactical thought, ensuring that my message was clear without giving them ammunition to twist or distort. I observed the interplay of emotions, the flickers of regret, the defensive stances, all reinforcing that the family dynamics had shifted subtly, irrevocably. My inner resolve strengthened. I would not allow this betrayal to define me silently. Each pause, each deliberate breath, was a signal that I was both present and poised, ready for the escalation that might follow. Finally, I stepped back, closing the folder with a soft but decisive snap. I stood, my posture straight, commanding without aggression. The room was heavy with unspoken understanding, my parents exchanging subtle glances that betrayed unease. They realized, without my having said more, that the first move had been mine and it carried weight. I didn't need to threaten, argue, or yell. Strategic patience would serve better than impulsive confrontation. As I walked toward the door, I could feel their eyes on me, each glance a reminder that the balance had shifted and the next steps would be mine to choose carefully. The first confrontation had been laid, a foundation for the battles to come, and I was ready to navigate each with deliberate intelligence and measured strength. Late evening had settled over Houston, casting long shadows across my home office as I sat at my desk, surrounded by files, receipts, and the soft glow of my laptop screen. The confrontation with my parents earlier still pulsed in my mind, a mixture of residual frustration and cautious determination. I went over every word, every hesitation, every subtle flicker in their eyes, searching for weakness, for patterns I could leverage. Their defensiveness had been telling, a roadmap to the cracks in their logic. I opened my notebook and began outlining all potential avenues to protect my account, document the favoritism, and ensure that no further unauthorized actions could occur. I didn't have the luxury of letting emotion override strategy. Every step had to be calculated, precise, and defensible. I reached out to a trusted colleague for advice, careful not to reveal the full scope of my intentions. Their guidance was measured, practical, reminding me to keep records meticulous, maintain discretion, and consider legal pathways. I printed bank statements, emails, and correspondence, aligning each piece of evidence with dates, amounts, and context. My fingers moved with deliberate rhythm across the keyboard, crafting drafts of formal queries to the bank, ensuring that each sentence carried authority without drama. In my mind, I rehearsed scenarios, responses from the bank, reactions from my parents, potential fallout if anything became public. Every outcome was considered, weighed, and cataloged. This was my first real taste of controlled retaliation, a careful, measured pushback that would establish boundaries without igniting chaos. Once my preparation was complete, I initiated the first tactical move. I sent a formal notice to the bank, inquiring about the $1 million transfer and asserting my rights over my account. The language was factual, devoid of emotional embellishment, designed to communicate control and accountability. While the message traveled across the digital network, I observed my surroundings, noting the quiet of the house, the faint hum of city life outside, and the sense of empowerment growing steadily inside me. The first acknowledgement arrived within minutes, a brief confirmation of receipt. It was subtle, almost clinical, yet it provided a flicker of satisfaction, the first hint that my strategy was working, that control was no longer entirely in their hands. Even as a sense of progress settled in, doubts crept in. Had I been too assertive? Was I risking unnecessary family strife? My chest tightened with the weight of years spent suppressing confrontation, yet my mind reminded me of the lessons learned from past injustices. Silence had never served me, precision and patience could. I separated the personal sting from the tactical decisions, noting each emotion as data to guide my next moves. I visualized potential confrontations with my parents or sibling once they became aware of my actions, preparing myself to respond without losing composure or clarity. The calculated anticipation sharpened my focus, transforming nervous energy into strategic resolve. By the time the clock ticked past midnight, the acknowledgement from the bank had settled in my inbox, confirming that the first step had been executed and that the initial phase of strategic retaliation was complete. I leaned back in my chair, the familiar weight of responsibility pressing against my shoulders, tempered by the empowering knowledge that the first move was mine. I could feel the subtle shift in momentum, the quiet reassurance that I was no longer a passive participant in this family dynamic. Each choice, each decision, was mine to make, measured and deliberate, reinforcing the truth that I would not be sidelined or dismissed again. The night stretched on, and I mapped out the next phase in my mind, how to confront my parents with undeniable evidence, how to navigate conversations without revealing every card prematurely, and how to maintain control while observing their reactions closely. The first move was complete, the real test, the strategic escalation, was still to come. I closed the laptop gently, took a slow breath, and allowed myself a fleeting moment of satisfaction. I had reclaimed a fragment of authority, a foothold in the landscape that had long felt tilted against me. Now, the path ahead demanded patience, foresight, and unwavering composure. Every step, every word, every silent observation would carry weight. The game had begun in earnest, and I was prepared to play it carefully, but relentlessly. The early evening sun filtered through the tall windows of our family estate, casting long shadows across the dining area where I found myself seated among familiar faces that suddenly felt alien. My parents moved with practiced ease, orchestrating compliments and attention toward my sister in a way that seemed seamless, yet every gesture, every word, was a subtle reminder of the favoritism I had grown accustomed to but never accepted. Neighbors and a few family friends mingled nearby, their casual remarks, meant as pleasantries, inadvertently highlighting the imbalance. As I sipped my water, my fingers traced the rim of the glass while my mind catalogued every interaction, every microaggression, every telling glance. I knew the gathering was more than a social event, it was a stage where my parents displayed control, and I needed to respond with careful calculation, not impulsive reaction. The first opportunity presented itself during a light-hearted conversation with my sister. She recounted her plans for an upcoming weekend trip, painting herself as diligent and deserving of every indulgence. I interjected with calm precision, pointing out subtle exaggerations and omissions in her retelling, my voice steady but firm. I observed the ripple of recognition across my parents' faces, the tightness in their jaws, the slight narrowing of eyes that betrayed defensiveness. My words were measured, devoid of accusation yet laden with insight, challenging the narrative without losing composure. Internally, my pulse quickened as I assessed the situation. Would they deflect, feign ignorance, or acknowledge the inconsistencies? I maintained a poised exterior, quietly testing the waters for potential allies among those present. The reaction was swift, though contained. My sister's defensiveness flared, her tone sharp as she twisted the conversation to assert her position. My parents, sensing the subtle shift in authority, increased their micro-pressure, suggesting in polite tones that perhaps I was overanalyzing or misinterpreting their intentions. I felt the familiar tug of internal conflict, the desire to react, to voice every grievance accumulated over years, versus the necessity of maintaining strategic control. I kept my composure, letting each exchange settle in my mental ledger, noting cues of guilt, hesitation, or manipulation for future use. Every smirk, every side glance, every small adjustment in posture became data points, helping me plan the next phase of counteraction. Later, I retreated to a quieter corner of the estate, the soft murmur of conversations and clinking silverware fading behind me. I pulled out my notes, cross-referencing the evening's observations with past incidents of favoritism and financial neglect. Consulting briefly with a trusted friend over a discreet call, I validated my approach, confirming that my measured, tactical responses were sound. We discussed potential strategies, weighing social, emotional, and legal implications of each move. I found clarity in the structure of my plan, maintain evidence, record behavioral patterns, and time interventions to maximize impact. The retreat allowed me to reset emotionally, transforming simmering anger into deliberate empowerment. As the evening drew on, I returned to the gathering, more aware of the currents of influence swirling through the room. Subtle signals confirmed that my parents and sister had sensed my scrutiny, perhaps even my strategy. Their cautious glances and slightly guarded smiles hinted at an awareness that the dynamics had shifted. Every word I spoke, every carefully controlled gesture, now carried greater weight. The balance of power had started to tilt, though neither side would admit it openly. I adjusted my approach, preparing to escalate when the opportunity was right, maintaining a poised exterior while my mind ran through multiple scenarios for the confrontation that would define the next stage of family interactions. I lingered near the edge of the room, watching the interplay of expressions, the delicate dance of appearances. My sister laughed at a story told by my father, but her tone had an edge I had not noticed before, an attempt at reclaiming attention that I silently catalogued. I allowed myself a small, private smirk, acknowledging the advantage I now held, the control ceded by careful observation and strategic patience. The next move would not be impulsive, it would be precise, deliberate, and backed by everything I had learned about their patterns and defenses. In that quiet awareness, I felt the shift solidify. I was no longer reacting. I was leading. The moment was approaching, and when it came, every action would be calculated, every word deliberate, every outcome anticipated. Everything had changed in subtle increments throughout the evening, a tension woven through every toast, every passing conversation, every exchanged glance. I could feel the undercurrent of anticipation settle in my chest as I stepped back, surveying the room and the family dynamics anew. The first signs of recognition had appeared, the first hints that my measured defiance had been noted, catalogued, and silently acknowledged. The next confrontation would be decisive, the first true test of the authority I had begun to reclaim. Every piece of evidence, every observation, every controlled response had led to this threshold. I straightened in my seat, taking a steadying breath, aware that the game was entering its critical phase, and I was poised to take command. I slipped away from the lingering conversations in the living room, my footsteps quiet against the polished hardwood floor as I retreated to the private study. The late evening air had cooled slightly on the terrace outside, carrying the faint scent of magnolia and freshly cut grass, a subtle contrast to the tension that had coiled itself around me all night. I closed the door behind me, shutting out the polite smiles and subtle jabs, and finally allowed myself to breathe. The events of the family gathering played over in my mind, each microaggression, each act of favoritism catalogued with a clarity that only years of quiet observation could yield. I pored over my mental notes, recognizing a pattern that had eluded me in earlier confrontations, a weakness in their presentation of authority, a blind spot in my sister's self-assuredness, a hesitation in my parents' responses that I could turn to my advantage. The frustration I had carried for months shifted into a sharpened focus, a readiness that was both exhilarating and deliberate. Settling into the study chair, I watched the dim glow of the desk lamp illuminate the scattered papers, receipts, and previous correspondence I had compiled. Every detail mattered, the timing of financial transfers, the understated praises for my sister, the subtle deflections when my contributions were acknowledged. I traced connections between these moments and realized that the key leverage point lay not in overt confrontation but in strategic revelation, exposing the patterns and inconsistencies in a controlled, undeniable manner. My pulse steadied as I rehearsed measured responses, envisioning different scenarios, anticipating possible manipulations, and planning for outcomes without allowing emotion to compromise the approach. What had once seemed like weaknesses now became tools, instruments I could wield to assert authority and reclaim what had long been ignored. From the terrace, I observed my sister and parents through the partially drawn curtains. My sister laughed with a family friend, oblivious to the scrutiny, her overconfidence laid bare in her exaggerated gestures and careless statements. My parents, proud and serene on the surface, betrayed hints of impatience and defensiveness when glances met or words were unintentionally clipped. I noted potential allies quietly smiling at small jokes or nodding at subtle insights, people who, if approached carefully, could reinforce my position. Each interaction, each nuance, became a piece of the puzzle I intended to complete, the psychological leverage points accumulating silently in my mind. Anticipating reactions and recording patterns, I recognized the moment when a calculated step could tilt the balance unmistakably in my favor. Returning to the desk, I prepared the documentation and visual cues that would serve as evidence in the forthcoming maneuver. Receipts, email threads, and notes detailing the overlooked contributions formed a strategic arsenal. I considered the timing carefully, which disclosure would be most impactful in public view, which private conversation would solidify my position without creating irreparable backlash. The process required meticulous attention, every gesture, every word, every glance needed to be deliberate, free from the shadow of emotional compromise. I consulted briefly with a trusted family friend, discreetly confirming the soundness of my approach without revealing the full extent of my plan. Mental rehearsals followed, tracing every possible counter from my parents and sister, weighing the risks and preparing contingencies. This was more than preparation, it was a strategic awakening, a realization that my intellect and composure were my greatest weapons. Later, a brief conversation with my sister tested my approach. I mentioned a minor family event where my contributions had gone unnoticed, framing it neutrally yet pointedly. Her initial reaction was casual dismissal, but I observed closely, the slightest flinch, the slight hesitation in her voice, the micro-expressions that betrayed awareness of my growing assertiveness. My parents interjected with defensive, almost rehearsed reassurances, signaling that they recognized the shift in the dynamics, even if they chose not to acknowledge it openly. I maintained composure, carefully guiding the exchange, drawing out evidence of their inconsistencies while keeping my own tone calm and precise. Each moment reinforced the path I had charted, each subtle acknowledgement serving as validation for the larger action to come. As the night deepened, I stepped back onto the terrace, the cool air sharpening my thoughts. I finally saw the opening I'd been waiting for, a specific oversight, a vulnerability in their collective facade that, if revealed strategically, could redefine the hierarchy of authority within the family. A small, revealing exchange during the evening had illuminated this point, and I allowed myself a quiet smile, acknowledging the potential of a calculated strike. Everything else, the frustrations, the past injustices, the simmering anger, was now distilled into precise focus. I was ready, not for confrontation born of impulse, but for an action born of strategy, patience, and unwavering control. The turning point had arrived, and with it, the power to reclaim what was mine. The living room felt unusually quiet as I stepped in, each footfall deliberate on the polished floor, my gaze scanning the faces of family and friends who had gathered for the evening. The air was thick with the faint scent of dinner and subtle perfumes, but it was nothing compared to the tension that radiated between us. I had rehearsed this moment countless times in the privacy of the study, running through every phrase, every potential objection, every flicker of guilt I could catch in my parents' eyes. My trusted ally stood slightly to the side, a quiet reassurance that someone besides me would witness what I had meticulously prepared. I drew in a controlled breath, anchoring myself in the calm I had cultivated over weeks of observation and reflection. Tonight, the careful strategy one had built from countless small insights would come to fruition, and the injustices I had endured would no longer remain unspoken. I began with measured words, a neutral tone that carried the weight of fact without accusation. I wanted to revisit some contributions I've made over the years, things that, for whatever reason, haven't been fully acknowledged. The words hung lightly in the air, seemingly innocent, yet precise enough to draw attention. My sister's eyes flicked toward me with a curious tilt, while my parents stiffened subtly, an unconscious acknowledgement that the evening's dynamic was shifting. I moved methodically, highlighting overlooked achievements and small victories, each point a deliberate nudge that exposed the discrepancies in attention and praise. Allies nodded imperceptibly at small remarks, their subtle affirmations lending quiet credibility to my observations. I watched, calibrated, and waited for the first cracks in the facade to appear. The next step was the careful unveiling of evidence I had amassed over the past months. I presented the financial records, documentation of the trust fund transfers, and discrepancies that clearly favored my sister's Paris trip. I articulated each point with composed precision, allowing logic to counter any emotional defenses. The evidence laid bare was undeniable, a pattern of favoritism that could no longer be minimized or excused. My sister's initial composure wavered, and I noted the subtle tightening of her lips, the slight flinch when her narrative was questioned. My parents, too, shifted under the weight of exposure, glances exchanged that spoke volumes about their discomfort and silent acknowledgement of the truth I had carefully revealed. Each statement was backed by concrete proof, leaving no room for counterclaims, and the balance of perception began to tilt decisively. As I continued, a surge of validation coursed through me, an internal recognition that my efforts to remain strategic, patient, and composed had paid off. The room's atmosphere changed imperceptibly, whispered reassurances among extended family members betrayed newfound awareness, and I sensed that the long-standing pattern of overlooking my contributions had finally been interrupted. My sister attempted defensive maneuvers, explanations twisted into partial truths, but I maintained control, responding only with calm, measured clarity. My allies' quiet presence reinforced the impact, silently supporting the authority I now wielded. I concluded the confrontation with a statement that was both firm and resolute. My contributions mattered, my voice would no longer be erased, and the patterns of neglect would be addressed and remembered. The evening drew on with a tense but controlled energy. Family members absorbed the confrontation in silence, their expressions a mixture of shock, reflection, and cautious acknowledgement. While the immediate battle had been won, I knew the larger war for recognition, respect, and fairness was ongoing. The quiet understanding that I would no longer be the overlooked youngest daughter settled in, a subtle shift that promised both empowerment and future challenges. My parents' reactions were complex, guilt intertwined with defensiveness, a hesitant recognition of boundaries now established. I allowed myself a brief internal smile, knowing that the careful planning and strategic patience that had brought me to this point had fundamentally changed the dynamic within the household. The path ahead remained delicate, but I had reclaimed my rightful position, and the first true acknowledgement of justice had been achieved. The garden felt calm now, yet I knew every smile and glance carried lessons I would carry for years. Evening light softened the edges of the estate, and the air smelled faintly of jasmine and freshly cut grass, a quiet contrast to the storm of emotions that had just passed in the house. I lingered by the fountain, feeling the cool stone under my fingers, letting myself process the culmination of months of planning, observation, and careful confrontation. The weight that had settled on my shoulders began to lift, replaced by a cautious optimism. My parents stood at a distance, their faces a mix of guilt and tentative acknowledgement. My sister's expression was more complex, a hesitant recognition, tinged with lingering denial, though the undeniable truth had pierced her carefully constructed shield. My ally remained nearby, a silent presence that had witnessed every strategic move and offered the steady reinforcement I needed. Inside the house, subtle shifts had begun. Conversations that once skimmed over my contributions now acknowledged the facts I had presented. The $1 million transfer, once a secret advantage for my sister, was no longer hidden, corrective actions were quietly set in motion, and a new awareness settled over the family dynamics. I communicated clearly my expectations moving forward, establishing boundaries that had previously been ignored, and setting a precedent for respect that could no longer be dismissed. Small gestures of reconciliation emerged, a tentative apology, a soft acknowledgement from parents, a cautious eye contact from my sister. The minor family members who had watched the confrontation displayed quiet respect, surprised perhaps by the assertion I had claimed, a recognition that I would no longer be sidelined. The subtle power balance had shifted, and I felt a renewed sense of authority and justice that I had earned through strategy, patience, and unwavering composure. Sitting alone later in the private office, I allowed myself to reflect. I traced the path from childhood, when my efforts went unnoticed and my voice was drowned out by louder claims, to the deliberate assertion that had led to today's recognition. Memories of past hurt arose but did not overwhelm. Instead, they offered context for the strength I had cultivated. My mentor's advice echoed in my mind: strategy tempered by calm leads to outcomes far more enduring than impulsive reactions. I recognized areas still needing healing, trust rebuilt, emotional scars smoothed, but for the first time, I felt capable of defining my identity independently of familial validation. The lessons of resilience, patience, and strategic thought had cemented a foundation for both personal and professional life, a blueprint I could carry forward with confidence. The fountain in the garden caught my gaze again, a symbolic reminder of beginnings and reflections, just as the small necklace I had kept from my grandmother had done since Chapter 1. I touched it gently, seeing not merely a family heirloom but a marker of my own growth, a quiet emblem of the control I had reclaimed over my story. The family observed the gesture without comment, the unspoken understanding visible in their eyes. Boundaries had shifted, and the youngest child was no longer invisible. I could leave the necklace where it had always been or take it as a personal emblem. Either choice symbolized a claim over my past and a control over my future. As the night deepened, the estate settled into a rare, reflective quiet. I walked the paths I had once wandered as a silent observer, now fully present as an active participant in the life and structure of my family. I understood that reconciliation and tension would continue, that relationships would require navigation, but I had established the clarity and authority to face whatever came next. The past had shaped me, but it no longer defined me. I had achieved justice, recognition, and a space for personal healing, and in that balance, a new chapter of life began, full of potential and tempered with wisdom. I finally felt seen, but the echoes of the past would remind me my journey was only just beginning.